All right. Well, hello, everybody. It looks like we have at least one other person here. If you haven't already, if you can like and share the stream, see if we can get some more friendly people in here, that'd be appreciated. Um, as it stands out tonight, we're going to be doing a special episode, special edition of the Mikestand. Go into a little more detail in a little while here. We're just going to wait a few minutes to give people a chance to show up. So tonight, instead of going through news articles from Batting into Comics or CBR or anything like that, I'm actually going to talk a little bit because we kind of got into a bit of a discussion last night. Lorenzo Sleepstack and I did, and I figured it might be a good time to just kind of hang out a little bit and talk a little pro wrestling history and talk about how we went from the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance's formation back in 1948 through the territorial years and then into the national expansion time of the 1980s. So and kind of take a little bit look at that. And of course, as always, feel free to ask any questions or make any comments. We'll see where the conversation goes. Um, so we're gonna wait a few minutes, give people a chance to, like I said, show up. I know there'll probably be some people lurking. And I do thank you for the like and share. Um, so in a rare occasion, we're gonna step away from the comics and anime stuff for a little bit here and just talk pretty much wrestling, pro wrestling, more its history than anything else. So, anyways. I am a real American, fighting for the rights of every man. I am a real American, fight for what's right, fight for your life. Do 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 do. When the world crashes down and it hurts inside. Do 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 do. Gotta be down, it don't help to hide. Do 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 do. Well, you hurt my friends and you hurt my pride. Gotta be the man, I can't let it slide. I am a real American, fighting for the rights of every man. I am a real American, fight for what's right. Fight for your life. You like this, you like that. He's big as a bull and he's quick as a cat. Know why? You ought to try. Looking out better than you look in your eye. Don't you know? Or get in his way. You know you're gonna have to pay. The man called Sting. Man called Sting. To the man called Sting. To the man called Sting. Here is the man in the box. I saw you in the box. Won't you come down and save me? Here is a man in the box. I saw you in the box. Won't you come down and save me? Let's see now. Bad Street, USA. Bad Street, Atlanta, GA. Bad Street, nasty and hot. Bad Street, that's what you got. Rush, rush. Thought I heard you calling my name now. Rush, rush. Thought I heard you calling my name now. On the day I was born, let us all gather round. I wonder, oh, voice to be found. That leave this one alone. Tell by the way, honey, bad to the bone. Simply ravishing. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Beat me if you can. Survive if I let you. What do you say? What? What do you say? By the way, by the look in your eyes, makes you believe I'm one of a kind. Makes you believe to the back of your mind. Makes you believe I'm one of a kind. Hey, hey, hey. Well, they call him the natural, as natural as can be. They call him the natural. He comes naturally. He's the son of a son, and the son of a gun. We know it's the natural. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Time to play the game, bum bum. Time to play the game, bum bum. Ha 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 ha. Do 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 do. It's all about the game and how you play it. It's all about control, and if you can take it, it's all about the death. Who's gonna make it? I am the game. You don't wanna play me. I am control. No way you can shake me. I am heavy debt. No way you can pay me. I am trying to figure out a. You know what? You think you know me? You think you know me? As you burn in my light, I am perfection. Perfection. I am perfection. Give it all you got, give it all you got, baby, come on. I know exactly what it seems. I will define the things you dream. Check out the score again. Come out a perfect 10. They broke the mold when they made me. I am perfection. Perfection. They call perfection. Give it all you got. Give it all you got, baby. Come on. Let's see. All right, 9 minutes. So we hit the 10-minute mark, then we'll get started here. And it would appear I'm the only one here tonight. Let's just double check and make sure we know that. See, that helps take up at least one more there. Alrighty then. It would seem I'm the only one here right now. I know there are other people streaming, but still. So, anyways, alrighty then. So, as I said earlier, what we're going to do tonight, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of reading over news articles, we're gonna take a look back at going to take a look back at a little bit of pro wrestling history, how basically from the start of from what I at least oftentimes consider, I guess, the start of the modern era, which was the formation of the National Wrestling Alliance back in 1948. So what ended up happening, of course, in 1948 was there were a number of promoters. Now, even prior to 1948, wrestling promotions were primarily territorial, which means you had um, basically everybody had their own territory. You didn't cross lines. It was considered very bad form to do so. So you had like the Central States area, which was like Kansas, Missouri, Iowa. You know, you had you had separate territory. You had like Minnesota had its own territory. You had the Northeastern Territory, which was known back then as the Capital Wrestling. The Northeastern Territory is what evolved into the what we know of today as the WWE. What many of us grew up with as either the Worldwide Wrestling Federation WWF or the World Wrestling Federation WWF. Had the Northeast Territory. You had, which of course covered from New England area down as far south as Washington D.C. You had Jim Crockett, who promoted in the Mid Atlantic area, which was Virginia and the Carolinas. You had, obviously a promotion being run down in Florida for a while there. You'd have a couple in Texas. Probably one of the oldest wrestling, wrestling promote. So the current oldest active wrestling promotion right now is actually down in Mexico. The CMLL Consejo Mundial de Lucha Libre, basically translated into English as the World Wrestling um, Council, which of course there's another organization in Puerto Rico also called World Wrestling Council. But since they use the Spanish name, that's why people don't get it confused. So yeah, and at least in the States here, for the longest time, one of the earliest territories was Pacific Northwest, run by the Owens family, Don Owens in particular, who'd run cards out of, Washington State, Oregon, and Idaho. But in 1948, a group of basically Midwestern Heartland promoters got together to form the National Wrestling Alliance, in which they unified the National Wrestling Association World Heavyweight Championship, the National Boxing Association Heavyweight Championship, and the World Wrestling Associates World Heavyweight Championship. They merged those titles into one title, with the first champion being Orville Brown. And at some point prior to his first title defense against Lou Thesz, he was involved in a car accident that ended up, ending up having them to award the NWA World Heavyweight Championship to Lou Thesz. Thesz, of course, had been one of the top stars of the 40s and had continued to be a top star throughout the 50s and into the early 60s. By the early 60s, his time was coming to an end. But and you'd have more and more territories joining the NWA. So Pinky, Georgia, Central States Territory, Leroy McGurk's, the Central States Territory, which was, as I said, Kansas, Iowa, and Missouri. You had Sam Munchik in St. Louis, a St. Louis wrestling club. which of course was home for a long time to Harley Race. You had the tri-state territory as part of that as well, which was Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. So in the early days, of course, you had you did have again there were territories you didn't try to swipe talent from each other's territories. It was a gentleman's agreement. Now, in establishing, of course, the NWA World Heavyweight title, so they established basically 4 World Heavyweight titles that were not bound to any one territory. You had the World Heavyweight, the World Junior Heavyweight, the World Women's, and the World Women's Tag. Those 4 titles, those 4 world titles, were not bound to any one territory. So those particular titles, the champions would actually travel the circuit, the territories, and defend the titles in each territory. And of course, as time rolled along throughout the 50s and as I said, more and more territories became part of the NWA. You had the Cattle Wrestling Corporation coming up in the 50s. You had Mid-Atlantic area, Jim Crockett Promotions joining the NWA. And being a part of it. They were, of course, at one point they were known as NWA Eastern States, in the 60s, and then eventually became Jim Crockett Promotion Mid-Atlantic. Let's see. You had NWA Mid-America, which was based in it was based in the Kentucky, Tennessee area. And in the Mid-America area, particularly in Tennessee, there were 3 distinct portions of the territory. You had Memphis in the west, and Nashville in central, and Knoxville in the east. You had the Florida territory. You had the Georgia territory, which started up in the 40s. You had World Wrestling Association. You did have NWA Hollywood out here in California until I believe it was like 61 or 62. But you did have some schisms in the early 60s that the late 50s, early 60s that started to break port. Like the Minnesota territory of the NWA became the AWA, the American Wrestling Association. And even prior to the national expansion of the 80s, the AWA kind of slowly but surely basically started becoming kind of the first promotion to kind of, even though they didn't necessarily promote themselves as a national promotion, they were operating almost like, because they would basically, the AWA, and it, from its start in 1960, when they broke away, when NWA Minnesota broke away from the NWA and became the AWA, with Vern Gagne and Stanley Blackburn, the 2 guys who led the way there. They would operate in the states and territories that NWA didn't. So the northern half of the heartland of the country, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Illinois, let's see, who else? The mountain time zone, basically. Whatever states were NWA was not promoting in, AWA was slowly over the years expanding. Let's see, and then there was a very famous schism that happened in early '63 when they put the NWA world title on Buddy Rogers, representing the Northeast, under promoters Vincent Jess McMahon, who Vince's father, and and let me see, and then who was the other one? Oh yeah, and Toots Mont. So that was what Now that's when Capital Wrestling Corporation, of course, became. They had changed their name. When they left. When they first left the NWA in '63. They changed their name from the Capital Wrestling Corporation to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and that was their first attempt at becoming kind of a national promotion. You know, they basically awarded, essentially stated that Buddy Rogers they laid claim to him being the first. He was in essence awarded the first WWF World Heavyweight title, and he was scheduled, I think, in April that year to defend that title against Bruno Sammartino, only to have suffered a stroke, and therefore he still went through with the match. He still recovered in time to go through with the match, but they had to make it a very short match, and that, of course, led to Bruno Sammartino. That led to Bruno Sammartino. Led to Bruno Sammartino becoming the first, basically the WWF champion, having that that initial 8-year reign. Now, throughout the '60s, of course, the WWF had operated as as kind of an independent, or even some might argue outlaw promotion, as NWA was kind of the thing at the time. Throughout the '40s, '50s, and '60s, when during its time, and as I said, you would have the NWA champion. Now, aside from, of course, the territories in the States, they did have territories up in Canada. Stampede Wrestling, which was home to the Hart family, that was a Hart family promotion. They were an NWA affiliate. There was an NWA affiliate in Vancouver, British Columbia. There was an NWA affiliate in Montreal, All Star Wrestling, that was run by the Rougeaus. In fact, the Vancouver at one point, the Vancouver promotion was actually at one point co-owned by former NWA World Heavyweight Champion Gene Kiniski. And also Japan, and NWA had their international affiliates, as well as primarily Japan Wrestling Association, which was started up by the guy who was considered the father of Japanese pro wrestling, Rikidozen. They Japan Wrestling Association was also considered a part of the NWA, and then as the JWA started to, due to, after things started to change significantly for the JWA after Rikidozen's death. I believe it was in '63. His two proteges, Shoei Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki, were two of the guys who were left to run company, and they eventually they'd be kind of the big stars of they'd be kind of the big stars of Japanese wrestling, in the '70s. Inoki would start New Japan in 1972, and then following years, Baba would start up All Japan. So NWA had its affiliates, They had international affiliates. They had affiliates here in the States. For a long time, CML, as I said, CMLL as EMLL, Empresa Mundial de Lucha Libre, which literally translates as World Wrestling Enterprises. They were also an affiliate of the NWA for a while there. So you'd have all these affiliates, and now granted, as I told you earlier, there were only 4 actual um, world titles that were recognized by the national as world titles: world heavyweight, world junior heavyweight, world women's, and world women's tag. There was no the NWA board did not recognize for a long time an NWA World Tag Team Champion, but you did have a bunch of territories that would recognize, an their own version of, you'd have like the San Francisco version of NWA World Title. You'd have the Central, for a couple of stints there, Central States had their claim to the World Tag Team title. You'd have Detroit, um, So, and you had like in Detroit, you had Ed Farhat, aka the Sheik, who'd run his promotion. I've already mentioned some of the others that we've talked about. The LaBelles, Gene and Mike LaBelle, were the ones who were running NWA Hollywood out here. At Don Owen up north, you had the Rougeaus running All Star Wrestling in Montreal. And of course, other promotions started popping up too, like some that would affiliate, like, for example, the Vachon brothers, Maurice and Paul Vachon, Mad Dog and Butch Vachon, respectively. They started up a promotion in Montreal called Grand Prix Wrestling, which was to serve as kind of a rival and was for 4 years. Against the Rougeau brothers. By 75, both All Star and Grand Prix had both closed down. The following year in 76, that's when Loot International was formed. And among the people who were part of that founding group included Andre the Giant, Frank Valois, Dino Bravo, and Gino Brito. Those guys were all involved in the founding of what they call Loot International, or International Wrestling, in Montreal. So, and 70, again, throughout, as television started to further expand, that also, gave content, for people to watch wrestling on TV. Hollywood wrestling was probably a nationally syndicated series. Which later gave birth to, of course, the WWF doing it, WWF doing it starting in the late 70s and into the early 80s. So by the time we got to the 80s, though, by the time we got to the early 80s, you were starting to see, like, Vince McMahon, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, or as Larry Zbyszko likes to call him, Jr. Vince McMahon Jr. Starting to, take over the WWF. Now, mind you, I had mentioned earlier that we had a second person there, I guess. Feel free to ask or comment. You guys have anything you'd like to add to the conversation here? Oh yeah, so there were a number of different different promotions had different styles. Like, for example, Mid America, which was also known as Mid America, which was the promotion that ran cards out of Kentucky and Tennessee. They were kind of more of a street brawling type federation, where wasn't as much technical wrestling going on as you would think. It was more, you know, fisticuffs. That area was, in the 70s was where Jerry Lawler had made a name for himself, in that area. Of course, Lawler, Nick Goulis was the main promoter in that area. So throughout, let's say, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you had McMahon and Toots in the Northeast. You had Jim Crockett Sr. up until his death in 1973 in the Mid Atlantic area. His son Jim Crockett Jr. took over, and for many of you, Jim Crockett Jr. was the one who was running, what eventually became WCW throughout the 80s. You had, of course, Eddie Graham had bought up the Florida territory in the late 60s. The Von Erichs had bought up the Texas territory in the late 60s. The Central States territory was Bob Geigel for much of the time, along with Sonny Myers and Bill Longson, Sam Munchnick out of St. Louis, Don Owen out of Portland. And then, I'd already mentioned some of the others as well. I said AWA was still going strong here. They were promoting in territories where NWA wasn't promoting, which was throughout much of the Midwest and the Mountain Time Zone and all that. Let's see. The NWA was concentrated a lot in the southeastern portion of the country. Now, even though the WWF had they had basically withdrawn from the NWA in '63. After Mons left the company, Vince McMahon Sr., Jess McMahon, he eventually, by '71, had actually rejoined the NWA very quietly. So it went from WWF World Heavyweight Championship to just simply being WWF champion. And as I said, the four main world champions would so you might have a couple shows where the NWA champion may go in and defend against, let's say, somebody like Bruno Sammartino or Buddy Rogers in the Northeast, and then they make their way down to Carolinas. They may, defend against somebody like Danny Miller or what have you, and then so on and so forth. So the world champions, the world heavyweight and of course for much of this time too, the Fabulous Moolah was actually a multi-time NWA. If you guys remember, she actually brought the NWA World Women's title with her to New York, and basically sold the rights to the belt to the WWF, and they changed the name of it to the WWF World Women's title. Now, if you have any questions or any comments on what I'm talking about here, feel free to chime in. If you have like specific questions on an area, like where you live, like if you want to know more, if you want to know specifically more about like where you lived and where you might have grown up watching, go ahead and ask that. I can probably answer. They of course they had a territory in Puerto Rico too. It wasn't until the 80s that you started seeing the national expansion. It started primarily with Vince McMahon Jr., the Vince McMahon we all know of today, the quote unquote genetic jackhammer. What he started doing in the 80s there, he started basically pilfering all the best talent from all the other territories, the AWA, NWA, they start. If you guys notice in the mid '80s, there you saw a number of guys on the WWF, including like guys like Junkyard Dog, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Hulk Hogan, Paul Orndorff, Roddy Piper, Greg Valentine. You know, a lot of these guys were coming in from other territories. So yeah, and then you had the national expansion going on in the '80s. It was started by Vince McMahon by pilfering. There was a very famous, very infamous date of Black Saturday in which Vince McMahon had bought the TBS time slot that had formerly been allocated to Georgia Championship Wrestling. Now, according to legend, the deal was that Ted Turner sold McMahon the time slot basically with the idea that the WWF was going to be producing studio shows in Atlanta, for the wrestling fans down south. They were going to be having like studio shows like they were doing just with WWF talent. That ended up not being the case. And, instead of promoting instead of promoting the shows on doing live studio shows, they would do tape programs with WWF wrestlers from around the country, which eventually led, of course, to Championship Wrestling from Georgia being born, as one of the companies to combat WWF's Georgia Championship Wrestling, headed up by, of course, Ole Anderson as promoter. This was like in '84 to '85. And this is, of course, what planted the seed for later for the Monday Night Wars of the '90s as well. Basically, Turner was not happy with what McMahon ended up doing, and McMahon needing money to promote the first WrestleMania, decided to sell the TBS time slot back to Turner, but he ended up selling it to Jim Crockett. Now, Jim Crockett, this is Jim Crockett Jr. at this point, who had been running the Mid-Atlantic area since his father's passing in '73. In the '80s, there he started, as some of the older territories like Detroit, NWA Detroit closed up shop in '81. NWA San Francisco, Big Time Wrestling in San Francisco, closed up in '81. I think Southwest Sports Incorporated had officially changed its name to World Class Championship Wrestling in '81 in Dallas. Let's see, the Mid America territory had basically been split up with first Robert the Fuller, the Welch family, aka the Fuller family, Robert Fuller, Ron Fuller, buying out the Knoxville area, and eventually also buying out the Gulf Coast territory, which was based out off the Gulf, the Panhandle of Florida, as well as southern Alabama and Mississippi. So, and again, guys, if you have any specific questions about specific territories or anything, or territories that you might have grown up in, let me know, and I can try to answer them for you. And you guys can also ask that in the comments if you watch this video afterwards as well. Yeah, so Now, to combat the WWF's expansion in the 80s, there was a bit of a group that kind of tried to come together to promote a kind of an inter-promotional entity called Pro Wrestling USA. This was Jim Crockett's Jim Crockett Productions, AWA, and the Memphis territory. That, of course, the Memphis territory run by Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler, who had broken away from Nick Gulas in 1977, and eventually had taken over much of that former territory, with the exception of the Eastern Tennessee part of it. Um, Continental Wrestling Association was basically the western 2/3 of Tennessee, um, and Kentucky, basically much of the old. Um, let's see, and by the 80s, of course, the Fuller's territory had changed its name from. They had actually changed their name in '74 when they first bought out the territory and became Southeastern Championship Wrestling. They started off with just having, of course, Knoxville, Tennessee, and then eventually expanded into Alabama by 1980, and by 1980 all the way down to the Panhandle of you know Mississippi had become part of Mid South. When Bill Watts had bought out Leroy McGurk's Tri-State territory in '79, he changed the name of that company to Mid South Wrestling. And initially, he was just promoting shows out of so Bill Watts had bought out the Louisiana and Mississippi territories from Leroy McGurk, and the Northern Mississippi territory, um, and was running shows in Louisiana and Mississippi, and Tri-State was still running shows in Oklahoma and Arkansas. And by '82, when Tri-State closed down, Bill Watts had bought up, Oklahoma and Arkansas, and that gave you Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi as Mid South Wrestling Association. Texas, you had you initially had in Eastern Texas, you had Southwest Sports, and big time wrestling out of Dallas, which eventually became world class. Um, in Western Texas, you had up until '81, you had Western State Sports, which was owned by the Funk family. Um, Initially, um, after their father passed away, I believe it's '73 or so, after Dory Funk Sr. passed away in '73, Dory Jr. and Terry took over the territory for a while, sold it off to um, Bob Windham and Dick Murdoch. Bob Windham, better known to most fans as Blackjack Mulligan. They'd continue to promote it under the Western States Wrestling brand, and then were eventually bought out in '80 by Ricky Romero and Nick Kozak, and the promotion eventually closed. Hi, Lorenzo. Yeah, I just figured I'd continue. I figured since we started that conversation last night, Lorenzo, I figured might as well just continue it with kind of just a general discussion overview of how things kind of evolved from the territorial days, from the formation of the NWA until the national expansion of the '80s. I'm streaming tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern. In addition to comic creators and video game and movie discussion, I plan to have a musician on as well. Here's our last stream. Yeah, I think I did pop in for a few minutes there, Lorenzo. Um, yeah, but as I said, I know you're out of Michigan, so I know for you, we talked about it too. As a child, very young child, when you probably started watching wrestling, at 5, well, actually, you said you didn't start watching it until the late '80s, early '90s. By that point, you were getting the WWF product syndicated, and if you had cable, you were getting like the NWA, WCW stuff. You know, oh yeah, I think I remember seeing you in the chat last week. Yeah, yeah. So I decided tonight, rather than read news articles, I figured since we kind of started that discussion last night, I might as well just continue it tonight. So I thank you for the like and share. Yeah, in the '80s. So throughout the '80s, most likely, Lorenzo, you would have probably gotten a lot of like the WWF syndicated programming. Um, you might have also got some of you probably well you when you got cable you would have got more like All American Wrestling, Primetime Wrestling, but as well as some of the WCW program, the NWA programming, with Jim Crockett Promotions, because like I said, by '81 the Detroit territory had been closed down. I think I started watching wrestling again as a teenager during the late '80s, early '90s. Yeah, I remembered Hulk Hogan as a kid. Yeah. Hulk Hogan was a big name for the WWF at the time. Ric Flair was a big name for the NWA. Anyways, I've got to step away from the camera for a moment, so I'll be right back. I'll be back in a couple minutes here. I'll be right back. All right, so I only remember the WWF as a little kid. When I was a teenager, I remember seeing other wrestling federations and or promotions. Um, so if So I would gather then if you were watching a lot of wrestling in the late '80s, early '90s, of course the WWF was still around then. They were still You still could get syndicated like superstars and wrestling challenge with Hogan, Savage, Ultimate Warrior, um, $1 Million Man, Demolition, Heart Foundation, um, some of the other companies that were active at the time. Um, by '88, Ted Turner had actually bought out Jim Crockett Promotions and had changed the name to World Championship Wrestling. I remember Jake the Snake Roberts. He was WWF when I watched him. Yeah, he had come to the WWF like in '86 and had been there like up until I think it was like late '91, early '92, and then he went to WCW for a year, and then kind of went off the radar for a while there. Wasn't with any of the major companies. Um, Among some of the other companies, you're in Michigan, so WCW was, of course, probably would have been watching like Pro and Worldwide. Um, let's see, Pro and Worldwide would have been syndicated, and then Saturday Night, which had evolved from World Championship Wrestling, which evolved from Georgia Championship Wrestling. That was Saturday Night, and that was on TBS. Main Event was on TBS at that point as well. If you had cable as a teenager, you could have got a lot of those shows as well. Okay, being in Michigan too, being in Detroit. Let's see what other, and you might have been able to catch some like syndicated stuff of some of it, depending upon you know, like if you were in Michigan, that meant you could have possibly got maybe some. Well, in the early '90s, there you could have probably got stuff from like Border City Wrestling in Toronto. What other companies were active or starting up around that time in the early '90s? There, of course, ECW was already starting to expand. Yeah, even though ECW started out as a NWA affiliate. Um, what ended up happening was, um, even after Turner had bought out Jim Crockett Promotions, World Championship Wrestling had still remained an NWA affiliate officially. I think pretty much up until '93. '93, they finally finalized the deal to get them to withdraw from the NWA, and they had become their own company. But prior to '93, I guess you'd see the writing on the wall in '91. Um, but WCW was another company that was initially an NWA affiliate. Um, so um, yeah, AWA had died out by '91. The last of the traditional NWA territories had ceased operations in '92. That was the Pacific Northwest Territory. Actually, their Saturday night program had aired its last episode in Portland. And I might have been able to watch ECW and WCW. Yeah, ECW, WCW, and WWF would probably been your options there. WWF was still syndicating stuff in the late '80s. There, you could have also watched some of their programming on USA, and of course, in '93, January 11th, 1993, that was the debut of Monday Night Raw. So I seem to remember the AWA. Yeah, the AWA as I was mentioning earlier, they were originally the Minnesota territory for the NWA. And then they had a very similar schism to what led to the original split between um, NWA and the Northeast promotion that we know of today as the WWE. AWA kind of formed in, or kind of formed or withdrew from the NWA in '60 and would promote throughout the Midwest and territories that NWA wasn't promoting it. And then they had a sister promotion that started up in '64 by Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder, called World Wrestling Association, which started up in '64 and ran until 1988. And then they would, of course, also absorb like the Memphis territory in the late '70s when they had split from the NWA, becoming an AWA affiliate, as well as Southwest Championship Wrestling in San Antonio. So, yeah, the AWA in the late '80s there had gotten a deal with ESPN to broadcast their weekly AWA Championship Wrestling show. And of course, during that time, you had, well, Bockwinkel was kind of at the end of his career, but as he retired, then you had like Larry Zbyszko and Kurt Hennig, who came into more prominence there. But a lot of guys were leaving AWA because they kind of saw the writing on the wall too. It's like Vern Gagne, who was the owner of the company, did not necessarily want to change with the times. He was still trying to promote the business as a wrestler, as a pure sport, and that just wasn't flying with a lot of people. So, and then of course in the '90s you had a number of companies start going more the hardcore route as an alternative to the cartoony WWE product and the wrestling of the southern southeastern United States style. So you had ECW. Again, they initially started out as an NWA affiliate. When WCW withdrew from the NWA, initially Eastern Championship Wrestling was going to be their national arm, but then it led to that very infamous incident in '94, where after Shane Douglas had won the NWA World Heavyweight title, he made that speech where, I don't want to be the champion of a dead company, throws down the 10 pounds of gold, and then elevates the ECW title as a world title, thus by changing the name of the company and from Eastern Championship Wrestling to Extreme Championship Wrestling, and in that same stroke, withdrawing from the NWA. Seems quite complicated. Well, it is because it's also in the '90s, in the late '80s, early '90s, as the territories were starting to die out. A lot of what was going on was you were starting to have more and more independents start popping up. So you'd have more, like, you still would have the territorial or regional promotions would start popping up, but they would strictly stick to their own territory. You didn't. ECW was kind of one of the ones that was trying to become a national promotion. The USWA, which was based out of Tennessee, was also trying to become national promotion, but ended up dying out by '97. USWA was the promotion that combined world class Dallas's World Class Championship Wrestling and the Championship Wrestling Association in Memphis. Again, that with the AWA was another attempt to kind of counteract what was going on with WWF and WCW. But you have all these independent promotions as well popping up at the time. You had Century Wrestling Alliance in New England. You had Windy City Pro Wrestling in Chicago. You had let's see, Mid Eastern Wrestling Federation. Well, there was one independent promotion that actually started all the way back up in 1967, but their records only go back to 1993. That was the ECWA, the East Coast Wrestling Association, which promoted shows out of Delaware. So yeah, but that's pretty much what happened. There was a national expansion in the 80s where you did have a number of companies. And then, of course, by 2001, WEF had pretty much had just about, obliterated much of its competition by that point, absorbing both WCW and ECW into their company. As both ECW and WCW finally closed their doors. Part of the problem with WCW is that aside from Turner and this really became apparent once Time Warner had bought out Turner Broadcasting. But aside from Turner, nobody else on that board really cared for professional wrestling. They wanted to get rid of it. They were kind of like, yeah, this is stupid. We can't make money on this. So they did that. Yeah. So as I said, I figured I would figured I'd do a discussion on pro wrestling tonight since we haven't done well. Part of this too was as I was trying to talk about last night, the Crockett Cup event from the current NWA is happening later this month on the 19th and 20th. The Crockett Cup was a tag team tournament that was originally started up in WCW when they were still known as the NWA back in the late 80s there. Back, 87, I think it was 86, 85, 86, 87. The original Crockett Cup was kind of a tag team tournament. It wasn't necessarily for titles or anything. It was just for bragging right, like who was the best team, much akin to like the World League tag tournament in New Japan or the Real World Tag League, World's Strongest Tag League in All Japan. So, but this year's Crockett Cup event is going to be main evented by Matt Cardona, who wrestled in the WWE a few years ago as Zack Ryder. He's going to be defending his newly won NWA World Heavyweight Championship against former champ Nick Aldis, who, from what I understand, didn't actually lose the title or was not pinned for the title. There's now a three-way dance for the and in that match, Jeff Jarrett, another former NWA World Champion, is going to be the special guest referee for that match. Let's see. I remember the new TNT, which I believe became no TNT was not. Let's see. Started playing Star Trek. No TNT was not. You're thinking. I think you're thinking TNN actually. TNT was Turner Network Television. Okay, TNT was part of the TBS family. You're thinking of TNN, the Nashville network that became Spike TV. started playing Star Trek, were they trying to get away from wrestling at that point? Well, no, because as I said, what you're talking about, the channel that became Spike TV was actually the Nashville Network, not not on TNN. Um, they were a different company altogether. TNN did have ECW on there for a while, and eventually, for a while there, they even picked up, Monday Night Raw. Hello, neighbors. Hey, Rick. So, Rick, do you have any like wrestling memories you'd like to share with us? Oh, that was the Nashville Network trying to get away from country music. Yeah, basically, that's what Spike TV was. It was them trying to get away from like the whole country genre. Yeah. Yeah. So, Rick, tonight, instead of reading news articles, I kind of just had a general discussion of um, of like pro wrestling history, kind of how they evolved from territories to national expansion. I know you're up in Canada. I understand correctly, you're from the Toronto. You're from Ontario, the Ontario area, right? You're from the province of Ontario, which I went to WrestleMania when it was in Toronto. Yeah. Oh, back in. So you went to the same one that Edge went to that inspired him to become um, a pro wrestler. You went to the one. You went to the Ultimate Challenge one between the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. That was 1990. Yeah, and born out of that in the early 90s, of course, Border City Wrestling, which in a way is where Edge and Christian and Rhino all got their start in the world of professional wrestling. Is in Border City Wrestling, which is based out of Toronto. Yeah. 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 So if you were watching wrestling in the late 80s, early 90s, then Rick, I would say then, because I think you're around the same age as I was at the signing of the match between Hulk and oh wow, you were back in '87 for WrestleMania 3 when Andre here in Hamilton. Yeah, probably at a time when they were taping programs and syndicating programs too. You probably got to see yourself like a few weeks later on, maybe on, I don't know, they called it Superstars. Well, actually, well, yeah, back in '80s, yeah, it was by then it changed its name to Superstars and Wrestling Challenge, respectively. But also, you were probably getting some of the, you probably got some of the taped shows from the Maple Leaf Garden as well. I would, if I remember correctly. So yeah, so WWF again had taken over Toronto after Maple Leaf. Well, they actually bought up Maple Leafs territory. Um, I don't think I was close enough to get caught on camera. Hmm. Well, that's probably good for you because they would probably not have liked it if you did. Obviously, they didn't want anybody, extra in the camera shot. Obviously, but yeah. Um, Yeah, so if you and I think you're kind of the same age as Lorenzo and I, you were probably watching wrestling in the late '80s, early '90s. You were probably getting a lot of WWF stuff as well. I would think even some WCW stuff, and then for you being in the Hamilton, Ontario area, you probably were getting, on if maybe on local access, you were probably getting some of the stuff from Border City Wrestling as well. The signing of the match was done in the ring. Hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah. So I take it then that Chris and Diana are already done, huh? And again, I do thank you guys for all the likes and shares. Um, I was only watching WWF at the time for wrestling. Yep, they are. Yeah. Um, yeah, a lot of people were, but doesn't necessarily mean that you didn't have. Doesn't necessarily mean you didn't have access to other wrestling promotions programming if you had wanted it. You know, I think in the early '90s era, aside from Border City Wrestling, let's say I think Northern Championship Wrestling was also starting up around that time up there too, in like 92, 93, around there. You know, you still had kind of the territorial feel with the independents starting to pop up there, particularly in the late '80s, early '90s, to serve as alternatives to the main ones. Let's see. Oh, I launched my pre-launch for the Canadian Shield. Ah, okay. Yeah, I had heard of WCW but never watched it. Yeah, WCW. Ted Turner had bought out Jim Crockett Promotions in 1988. WCW previously had basically been the Mid Atlantic territory. It started out as the Mid Atlantic territory of the NW. It actually started out as Jim Crockett Promotions, all the way back. Some people say it goes all the way back to the 30s, and then in '73, when Jim Crockett Sr. had passed away, his son Jim Crockett Jr. took over and renamed it Mid Atlantic, NWA Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling. And then during the national expansion of the '80s, there, Mid Atlantic Champions started growing. They would start to absorb a number. Let's see, they do it from during. Let's see, I believe. Well, let's see. No, actually, WWF had bought out the St. Louis territory when they finally closed that down in '85, and then for about 5 months in late from late '86 to early '87, Jim Crockett Promotion started had actually bought out Bob Geigel Central States territory, which as I told you guys, Central States territory was Kansas, um, Iowa, and Missouri, northern three quarters of Missouri, and then end up selling it back to Geigel, who went on and instead of rejoining the NWA, formed World Wrestling Alliance, you know, for about a year before closing that promotion down. Um, Jim Crockett also during that time, you know, basically absorbed the Championship Wrestling from Florida, the Florida territory. You would see the legend Gordon Soley become more and more part of WCW by that point in time. Um, Basically, WCW was born basically when Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling and Championship Wrestling Georgia merged in 1985, and Jim Crockett actually bought back the Saturday time slot from TBS, the TBS Saturday time slot from the WWF. McMahon had sold it back there for so he had capital for the first WrestleMania there. Um, so let's see. So by the time Ted Turner bought out Jim Crockett and had become World Championship Wrestling, they had absorbed the Florida Territory Championship Wrestling from Florida, the Georgia Territory Championship Wrestling from Georgia, the Mid South Territory, which had become known by that point as the Universal Wrestling Federation, which was basically owned by Bill Watts. That's where like Ted DiBiase, Jake Roberts, the Freebird, the Fabulous Freebirds, Junkyard Dog had all made their names. Butch Reed as well. The Central States Territory, even though they sold that one back. And eventually by 93, WCW had withdrawn from the NWA and had started to become a national organization and was basically throughout the 90s had been competing with the WWF as the other national promotion. A lot of this was stemming from the Black Saturday the Black Saturday incident that I talked about earlier when McMahon had bought out the TBS Saturday time slot, promising Turner to produce studio shows in Atlanta for the territory with WWF wrestlers, but instead, actually, not even with WWF wrestlers, with the NWA wrestlers, but McMahon just just basically did tape shows from other regions, and the Southern fans did not care for that at the time. So, and that's what also led to like Mid South and Georgia Championship Wrestling, Georgia, um, starting up programs at other times during on TBS. So yeah, so we're at an hour 19. So I talked quite a bit about wrestling tonight. At least you guys came in late and we had some good discussion on specific territories. So, but with that, guys, I think I'm going to go ahead and start winding down a bit here because by the time I get through all the history stuff, it should be pretty close to hour and a half. So, unless there's more you guys want to talk about with wrestling or anything like that, if there's anything else you guys wanted to ask about wrestling or anything else neat, of course. I'm just giving you guys a moment here to see if you guys want to say anything more about what we've been talking about or not, and I might just go ahead and start winding down for the night. Summer breeze makes me feel fine, blowing up the jasmine in my mind. All right, well, as it would appear that I guess there's nothing more people would like to say on the matter. Guess I'll go ahead and start wrapping things up then. I thank you guys for being here tonight. I hope you guys learned a little bit more about maybe some of the areas where you guys grew up, the wrestling history of the areas you guys grew up in. Don't forget this Friday, of course, Backup will be with me as we do our weekly look back at comics history, in which we'll be going through Feature Funnies Volume 1, Number 15. Be reading some of the features will include The Clock and Black X from Quality Comics. Be concluding our October 1938 coverage this Friday. So, so with that, today being Wednesday, March the 2nd, why don't we go ahead and take a look back at this day, Nietzsche history. History. So, anyway, so on this date, first off, on this date, back 80 years ago today, as I get there, the 10th issue of Daredevil from Lev Gleason Publishing, went on sale on this date for 10 years. Now, this is not to be confused with Marvel's Daredevil. This, I think, was, I'm not even sure if this was even if he was even a superhero, but the 10th issue of Daredevil from Lev Gleason went on sale on this date in 1942, 80 years ago today, for 10 cents. It was 64 pages. There's that. Then, as we move on to the next piece of Nietzsche history here, on this date in 1992, which was 30 years ago today, the let's see, the United Artists Murakami Wolf Swenson MacB produced animated series James Bond Jr. Um, and ended its syndicated run on this date in 1992. On this date, in 1992, the animated series James Bond Jr. would end its run on ITV Central. So it was basically a syndicated show here in the States, syndicated cartoon. And finally, bit of a passing to talk about here on this date 10 years ago today. Doug Furnis, former professional wrestler and bodybuilder, powerlifter, passed away at the age of 52 on this date in 2012. He was probably most well known for his time as as one half of the successful tag team Phil LaFon over in Japan, and also his brief runs in ECW and WWF. But he also wrestled for WCW for a short time in the early '90s as well. So on this date, 10 years ago today, Doug Furnis, former professional wrestler and powerlifter, passed away at the age of 52. So with that, guys, let's see. I know we're coming up a little short here. I hope everybody. I hope everybody gets. Feel free to comment. If you watch this show later, as I do keep them up. If you guys want to check them out and check out the information, and you can ask me questions and what have you. Let's see. And with that, guys, I thank you again for being here. I thank you guys for all the likes and shares. And and tomorrow we probably will have at least a few items to discuss in terms of news items. I'll probably build up again. So with that, guys, I thank you again for being here, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.